Hi, my name is Max Gagliardi, and this is the Talk Energy Podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. I think I'm up to like 120-something subscribers on YouTube, and for those of you that have subscribed, I really appreciate it. And for those that haven't subscribed, hit that subscribe button, help me out. This episode's guest is Tom Robbins, the president of Solid Foundation Consulting and the former Secretary of Energy and Environmental for the state of Oklahoma. Tom has worked in various roles in the energy industry, and he's always somebody that seems to be in the know, and not just when it comes to energy. Whether it's advice on how to get elected to a political office or what's going on in the Oklahoma City tech scene, Tom's a guy that may not know all the answers, but odds are he knows who does and can get you connected with that person. This episode is filled with discussions around Tom's background in energy and politics, his time spent as the Oklahoma Secretary of Energy and Environmental, and what he did to tackle the earthquake problems that we have in this state. And lastly, we talk about Tom's nonprofit efforts and what he's doing to make the energy industry a safer place for workers and the community as a whole. Hope you enjoy the show. But it's been fun, and I'm glad to have you on. And I'll do the intro here. Tom, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on and agreeing to do this.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it launch. It's been super successful. You do everything 110%. So I'm not surprised.
I was telling you about it before it came out. I was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, and you were encouraging about it, so that was helpful.
Yeah.
And I knew I wanted to have you on. I talked about having you on early. And I think you've done a lot of different things in energy, and you also do a lot of other interesting things that I think we could do a whole podcast just talking about some of the other stuff that you've got going on. But I think there's enough common, you can weave it. There's enough energy involved in it to where we can touch on the energy things. We'll also touch on some of the tech stuff you've got going on, which I think is really cool. Yeah. And then and we'll just see where the conversation goes. But I think the easiest thing to start is just, and I think I know most of the story, but how'd you get into the energy space? And then let's talk a little bit about how you got into it, and then we'll go maybe talk about some of the CHK days for a minute.
So I just wanted to just start this off. I was a really cool kid, and the definition of cool is when you're 16 and you're one of two kids from your state that attends the Republican National Convention as a youth delegate. You get to know your congressman and help them campaign, and your state representatives, and start the debate team at your high school. So that's the platform of coolness of which all this was launched.
Yeah.
But I always had the political bug, always loved sort of like all things politics. When I was a little kid, my parents would be like, hey, who's running? Like, who do we vote for?
Yeah.
And that was just my thing. And made it out to D.C. During the summers of my college, got really interested in that kind of stuff, doing interning. And post D.C., got to be a fly on the wall, staffed the Senate Judiciary Committee. When I say staffed, it was fill up water jugs, sharpen pencils, answer phones.
Nice.
But it was all during the Justice Alito and John Roberts confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay.
So it was a really interesting time and a big spotlight that was happening on that committee. It was pretty contentious then, I felt, but that was like a walk. That was a walk in the park.
That's bad as now.
You know, some fun things, you know, about like Supreme Court justices, they're kind of picked out of obscurity. Nobody knows who really they are before they're nominated.
Yeah.
So they have like a little detail that helps, you know, follow them around. Then they actually have official security at the Supreme Court. But I remember like Alito's family, like his wife and him would just kind of like wander off a little bit because like you're not used to having like a U.S. Marshal like shadowing you. I remember one time the Marshal's like, hey, where's that guy? And so it was fun. You're kind of in the room where it happens.
Yeah. When was this in your age? How old are you?
I was in my mid-20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I was out there, had a great time, and one of probably the funniest stories is, you know, it's if you understand that a big part of it is theater and it's people playing their role, and it's all depends who has the power and what they're saying, and that's true today in politics. And so I remember I was in the back of what's called an ante room, and that's where they hang out while the committee hearing's going on, and literally, you know, I'm there to like fetch them their notes or do whatever they need.
Right.
And they were grilling John Roberts, the Democrats were. And Dick Durbin came back there, and he was the minority whip at the time. Patrick Leahy was the ranking member, meaning he was a senior Democrat on there. And they start talking about John Roberts. And Dick's like, how do you think we did out there? This is a lifetime appointment. We got to stick it to him. And then finally Patrick Leahy's like, oh, man, this John Roberts guy, he's like the 40-year-old virgin. Like, he went to law school. We got nothing on him. And then they went out there and attacked him again, right?
Yeah.
So there's that, like, recognition of the theater of it, of where they were just, you know, for their constituency, for the lifetime appointment, for the political angle, like they're throwing stuff at the wall. They didn't really have anything. The guy was brilliant.
Right.
He like scribbled down, like I'd pick up his pad of paper at the end of the day. I'd have like a scribble on it.
Yeah.
So he was great as far as that hearing and being a justice is concerned, but just kind of the politics of it. So I've always been involved in government, political deal. Married a girl from Oklahoma, and so we were living out in D.C. Got my master's from George Washington and a master's called political management, which is all things kind of public affairs,
Right.
government relations, lobbying, and just looked to come be by family. Didn't want an hour commute.
Yeah.
Wanted
No
like
joke.
that novelty of like a backyard. I remember I just
Sure.
looked at her and like, hey, what about Oklahoma? So ended up doing a couple of things, but along the way was hired when Aubrey was building and growing the rocket ship over there,
Yeah.
and became their manager of kind of their grassroots PAC, Political Action Committee.
Real quick before we launch into that, so we met in like 2010, I think.
Oh, yeah,
you were
I
at
forgot about
Williams
that. Yeah.
for a while. So
Yeah.
you went to Williams first, I guess. Or was that the first energy?
Yeah,
company?
so so I got recruited to Oklahoma by a startup, and was super excited about it. It was the people that had owned the TV Guide Network that, ironically enough, was headquartered in Tulsa.
Yeah.
And when that broke up in the magazine, anyway, there were some executives there that had this idea to launch kind of a TV show. And in DC, I'd been a coordinating producer for George Washington University Studios and Productions, and working with a bunch of networks that they had and live studio audience stuff. And I was introduced to them. They're like, yes, we want your talents. And then they flew me out and gave me a great salary. And then I showed up, and 2008 happened, and the funders
Yeah.
were like, hey, so we're not going to fund this startup anymore because we want to take care of our like mothership.
Yeah.
And so within like 3 to 4 months, that all went away.
Yeah,
And
man.
I went and reached out to the head of government relations for Williams, because they're a big company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they didn't have a role. And the HR person in the room's like, hey, I really like you, like, and you're very personable. You're great with people. Would you ever consider being a recruiter? We have a college recruiting position open. And I was like, in my head, I was like, I have a mortgage. That sounds great.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, right.
And so I started working at Williams and was there for 2 years and did college recruiting and had a bunch of campuses, which is now totally forgotten. That's actually how we initially,
Yeah.
that's how we initially met. So I'd go around touring campuses and recruiting and giving offers and all that kind of stuff.
It's about as early in my career as I've known anybody. I would, not that we've like stayed in super good contact over the years. I feel like we've had touch points over the years, but in terms of just going back to energy, you're probably one of the very first people that I've interacted with. I mean, anybody that I met during that kind of 2009-10 era, when my first kind of job in the industry. So we go way back.
Yeah. So I would be at Chesapeake and college recruiting. I'd get done with my job super snappy quick, and then I'd be all interested in all their political and community stuff.
Right.
And so I met all those people and just started picking up projects. And then Chesapeake was, again, taken off like a rocket ship. Those are the days when they had like a full page ad in the newspaper, like
Yeah.
announcing who they were hiring and stuff.
Right.
And somebody had told me that they're looking for a full-time government relations manager, which better fit kind of where my skill set was at. And they wanted that person not in D.C. but Oklahoma City to run what they call their PAC, or Political Action Committee. And I remember telling my wife, it's like, I'll go check it out. And then at the end of the interview, I was like, oh, okay, yes, this is unique. This is crazy. Crazy fun and really cool opportunity. So I went home and said, yeah, we're taking, let's go.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there was these cool roles. I mean, Chesapeake had your normal, traditional energy company roles. Landman, you got production
I call it Land
engineers.
Army.
Yeah, Land Army, production engineers, geologists, midstream marketing guys. But your position was definitely like one of these unique categories, at the helm of this, behemoth company that was doing all this growth. And so I would kind of, I had Taylor Shin on, and I think his position was really interesting too, because it was like, those were these kind of like positions that you looked at and you're like, that's not normal. Like, you're not a normal rank and file person. You're doing something that is like, I thought pretty unique and cool at the time for that enterprise.
Yeah. Any basically publicly traded company, because they have issues before Congress and need to communicate with lawmakers, they'll have a political action committee. Aubrey was unique in that he wanted to be the tip of the spear. And so his marching orders were, I want the biggest, best tools in my toolbox. And one of those is a PAC.
Yeah.
You've been hired to do that because we feel like you have the skill set, go do it. And so that was the really empowering part. And I think people find this in energy a lot, and like startups, but particularly Aubrey, is that like, if you had a project or an idea and you felt like, hey, I'm going to put you in this role, you got all the tools and all the resources. So I remember like literally met with my worked right there with our senior vice president, a guy named Tom Price, the EVP there, and like said hello, got my marching orders, pretty much locked myself in my office for 2 weeks, came out with the plan, synthesized it with our team, then brought it to Tom. He signed off on it, gave it to Aubrey. I still remember like Aubrey, like he gave me the stuff back with his handwritten notes. So like I was putting together all these best practices, like have pack leaders in every department, like people that were interested in it to be able to do peer-to-peer stuff. And like, I was like, oh, I'll do like a training with them and it'll be an hour over lunch. He like handwrites in there, like this can be done in 30 minutes. Like people who know him, that's not surprising at all. No. But my kind of Chesapeake.
Was it with a Sharpie? Like
I forget. It was like a marker.
I swear this is the marker that he used. I swear it was like one of these because I bought these because I used to use them with Aubrey and he would make us order them, and so I've gotten used to using these. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure this is like the exact.
But like he would that's the way he was. And pretty much he's like, what do you need to be successful? And I like laid out a best practices plan and they said yes to like 98% of it.
Yeah.
Everyone has like this is Chesapeake moment. Mine was, so like I'm organizing all this and we had launched, it was literally from the day I was hired, it was within 90 days, we had launched a full re-engaged, reimagined PAC program, which is like unheard of because usually you just don't get that type of support to do that. And, remember I had a setup. There's a guy who did, people who work there know, there's a guy who did all the catering. His name was, we called him Redmond. Yeah. Awesome guy. And had this whole staff that just ran around and took care of all the meals, all the special events, all the dinners.
There's a lot.
And so this, like my boss was like, hey, call Red, set up your food. So I call Red and I'm like, hey man, I need, we're doing like 8 different presentations this month and this and that. He's like, well, what do you want? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, we got like short ribs or barbecue or like, I'm like, okay. And then like finally as we're having this conversation, because I just come from Williams, I go, so I'm pretty new here. I guess I would have to ask like our senior vice president or whatever, but like cost code wise, like what code do I need to get you or what form needs to be signed? He literally laughs at me and he goes, so Aubrey approved this project, right? Like you were told to do this? I go, yeah. He goes, yeah, there's no cost code. Like just tell me when and where. And it just blew my mind, you know? Of course, one might say you can't run a business very profitably that way, but that was the Aubrey way.
There was no cost spared during the heyday of Chesapeake.
And so we got great results. We actually, for Political Action Committee, we had the most kind of growth of energy company the years that I ran it, and became one cycle number 2 only to Exxon.
Yeah,
which our company from Oklahoma City, right?
I feel like there was pressure to join the PAC. I feel like I ended up joining it. I don't know.
Probably did because you like me so much.
They were like, we can't force you to do this.
We did.
But you're doing it.
No, well, we did leadership stuff. It's very unique to have a CEO that's like willing to put out a video and like willing to put out an email.
I feel like they like called and left messages maybe, or maybe not.
Well, definitely everybody got an email with a video from him. And then we did like different events and stuff. I don't know if you remember, but like I would have like, then Congressman Lankford come or whoever. Right. And we would have different people come and do different events or do different town halls and stuff. So we were very, very active in that arena for sure.
Sure. So what year was that? Do you remember whenever you got into the PAC role?
Gosh, that would have been like mid-2000s. And then I did that for just under 5 years.
Okay.
And I actually stayed on. So like when Aubrey left and most of the senior management, including my EVP, left, and they took our office down to just 3 people in all of Oklahoma City, which if you think about it, it's a lot. It's a lot of shrink.
Yeah.
And but I guess they gotten good feedback on me and knew that I understood that role and could do it for them. And so the new management was happy to have me there, and I worked with them. Of course, then when the barrels hit about 30, and they were in survival mode, and I think you talk to different people, they're probably within a few hours TikTok of declaring bankruptcy. Now they actually went through that, but this is a couple of years back. I really think they were really short when they did a final initial layoff that I was a part of. But I think a gift is change. I really do. In my career, I look back and all those inflection points that were painful.
Yeah.
Every single one of them has resulted in a better opportunity.
Oh,
every single one of them. And the thing about like a place like Chesapeake, great benefits, great comp, good team, amazing campus, opportunities for growth. And so on your own, you're not very prone to say, well, I'm going to do my own thing now. But given, really, I don't know if my wife would agree, but I'd call it a gift of being let go. It really is, because it makes you hard look and re-examine and take on different roles or responsibilities.
For sure. And I've been through it. And I think a lot of people in this industry have been through some type of parting from one, either whether it be a job getting let go or being just whatever, forced to make a change, whatever that, catalyst was, right? And I think for me personally, it's always been a good thing. And every time I go into those moments, especially when you're like self-employed, I feel like if you've got clients or you're doing things where you're entrepreneurship, you're getting laid off all the time. Like you have a client.
Well, I think in this generation views a little bit differently, whereas like our parents or grandparents would be like, I'm gonna work for GE and get the gold watch. I'm kind of under the mindset of, yeah, is it possible I could go work for a company again? Yeah. If the opportunity is right, if the mission was good, but really even when you're just, an employee of one company, you're really self-employed with one client. That client tends to take care of you very well.
Yeah.
But we're in Atwell State in Oklahoma, right?
Sure.
So things go up, things go down. It's not personal when you're a publicly traded company. There's a ledger,
right,
and decisions get made. I always say in our industry, the only constant is change.
Sure. What to touch on Chesapeake a little bit more, I mean, how cool of an opportunity was that? And just like, I'm sure the networking and just all the different things you got to see. I mean, I'm assuming there was just some pretty crazy, I mean, I don't know, you told some stories already, but anything that sticks out, just like maybe before you answer that question, some of the things you did in that role, just kind of specifics, was it truly just raising money effectively, or was it actually getting into pushing the causes forward, like connecting the dots with the right, or just kind of all of the above? Like, help me out understand that, because that role to me is always like a little bit opaque around everything that would go down.
So we raised our money into our like a federal PAC,
right?
And then the states that we were, and that would be directed towards candidates that supported the industry, and federally. So that's your United States Senate, Congress, President, and all that. Outside of that arena, you have all the different states, which at the heyday of Chesapeake was, there were many basins, many states that we were engaged in. And so the way it works with PAC dollars, generally speaking, is that you can take them on a federal level and then put them into a state PAC. So we had giving that we could do in Texas, in Pennsylvania, in West Virginia, and Ohio. And each of those states and those basins had their own government affairs, community relations team. And so we would work with them on coming up with a budget and a strategy around who they needed to engage or support. And then there was election time, and so we do voter registration. There was education engagement, where we do town halls, or I do calls with different public policy makers. And then, you'd get like a steady flow of people that would ping you with different questions. And I made it a point to try to like meet with as many new employees as possible. Yeah. And actually, a story would be his Jeff Bice was working at Chesapeake at the time. He was in IT. He was a PAC member. He pinged me and was like, hey, my wife is thinking about running for some state office. Would you and be willing to meet with her? And I remember like when I got the email, I kind of like rolled my eyes because I'd gotten a few of those before. And I was like, hey, I'm thinking about running for office. And it's like no context, no clue, no strategy.
By the way, when I called you about this podcast, I was like, I have this idea, this thing I want to do. You're like, are you going to run for office? I feel like you asked me that question. I was like, no, dude. I was like, I'm not.
People approach me a lot. They want like advice about how's that work and stuff. So I remember we set up a little lunch, me and our VP of government relations with Jeff. His wife comes in, Stephanie Bice. Mm-hmm. And she was looking at running for the state Senate. I remember walking away from that and telling my boss, John, I was like, oh, she's awesome. She got it. She'd done her work. She asked intelligent questions. And so it was great. And so like literally, we've been friends ever since, and I've helped her out. And personally, she's just one of the best people I've ever met.
Can you help me get her on the show now? And, she's a big deal now.
Well, there we go. So but obviously she's back in DC, right?
Yeah.
So just funny things like that happen. That was from an email from an employee like, hey, my wife's thinking about doing something. Yeah. I don't know if Jeff would have sent that email if he knew all the sacrifices his family would have to make, but they're awesome. I'm glad they're out there.
I mean, that's a daunting, that would be pretty daunting. It takes certain kind of people that have the passion to want to go there, but I can't wrap my head around wanting to do it. But I'm glad that there are people that want to serve publicly like that. But no, I think she's that was a pretty high profile race just recently, not to get too into the politics of things, but that was a fairly high profile race. I feel like even at the national level, just with trying to flip seats and everything going on, and she got it done.
Yeah. It was a top targeted race in the country. And I think she was obviously a fantastic candidate. She works hard. You can tell I've met with dozens of candidates and running for all types of different offices. And a lot of them want to kind of just sit behind their computer or their iPhone and just dial it in, or like kind of look or act busy or engaged. And like, she's on the doors. In fact, she likes it. I wouldn't say all candidates, that's their currency, but she loves hitting the doors, talking to people, getting out the message. She had like some saying like Saturdays for the doors, and like she works it. So good combination of hardworking and I don't know if some people know this, but she got elected, I guess, president of her freshman class.
Okay.
which, it's not like a constitutional role, but it's like an advisory role with House leadership and stuff. So she's respected. She's part of this new group of women that came in, particularly on the Republican side. And so I see a really bright future for her.
That's awesome. So you were at Chesapeake for how many years you said total?
About 5.
About 5 years. And then when did you left and you started, was the safety your startup?
So actually, so we went and was approached and had the opportunity to serve for the governor as Deputy Secretary of Energy. So the way the governor of Oklahoma is set up, he's got a cabinet. Governor Fallin had combined energy and environment, which is really smart. Those need to be talking, working together. And so the way that was, Michael Teague, who had just retired and given up command of the Corps of Army Engineers out in Tulsa District, who had a full career in the Army Corps of Engineers, going all throughout the world, building cool infrastructure projects while people are shooting at him, was asked by the governor, hey, would you be our Secretary of Energy and Environment, these combined roles? And then he had a deputy for environment, Tyler Powell was his name, and then I was asked to step in after a while to be the deputy of energy. And so I got to represent the governor on a kind of a wide variety of compacts, organizations, and things that she either has an appointment to or a voice in or is asked to participate in.
Right.
Prepared all of her remarks, and then worked with the oil and gas industry, obviously, propane, kind of all things energy. The big thing that was going on at the time was earthquakes.
Sure.
And so I spent about 80% of my time on that. And my boss, Michael Teague, as a secretary, stood up the coordinating council on earthquakes for Oklahoma, and I coordinated that. And I remember I walked into his office. He's like, "Hey, I got to talk to you. You got some media expertise. You've been out in Washington D.C." He's like, "Let me know when you got a minute." I was like, "Yeah, what's going on, Mike?" He goes, "Oh, so PBS NewsHour is here, and Time, Newsweek, and 60 Minutes is going through everybody's trash, and we're going to be the face of that, so we got to get ready for it." And I was like, whoa, that's like what you just rattled off constitutes. And the Secretary of Energy and Environment had this very small policy staff, no media, like no official media, like that wasn't my role. We didn't have an official media person. I looked at him, I was like, "Hey, Mike, just so you know, like what you just rattled off and its potential impact and messaging and consequences, that would be like a tough year for like a Fortune 500 company."
Right.
He's like, "Yeah." So I also helped him with all those elements.
I kind of forgot about that. Yeah. Now that you're saying this, in my mind, I had forgotten about this role. It's a really interesting one. That was just a time where the earthquakes and everything, I mean, it was like they were happening. I mean, whatever we did at the state, I know we put some regs in place with those. And I also think probably the downturn in pricing and just less drilling, less moving away from some of these higher water cut areas like the Miss Lime and some of these other areas that were just injecting just tremendous amounts of water. I don't know if it was a combination of things, the regulations plus just the different areas shifting where we were drilling and how much water was being injected. But there for a minute, it was earthquakes all the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of things. One is just from a public standpoint is that things were shaking and people just wanted it addressed. And so my boss kind of took that bull by the horns and said, let's get all the right people in the room.
Right.
The second thing is just from like a geological standpoint, we kind of take for granted what we know about oil and gas. The average person like feels like it's like, they think it's like, shot a shotgun and up came a little bubbling crude. Like that's their kind of mentality of oil and gas. They don't realize, I got a water bottle here that I'm holding, is that when you're drilling, 85 to 90 to 95% of that might be what we would refer to as some sort of produced water element to it. And only that, anywhere from 5 to 2 to 3 to 4% might be some sort of hydrocarbon that we want, whether some, gas or oil. And so then what do you do with the rest of that produced water? I think most people feel like when we're drilling, whatever's coming out of that pipe is like
geyser of oil shooting out of the ground or something,
they've seen those images.
Yeah.
And so they don't really understand, particularly in our formation, kind of what that looks like and feels like. Ultimately, we could probably do a whole podcast with Mike and dive into the details of it. I will say is that the industry really stepped up and they started to share their seismic data. They spend a lot of money and it's proprietary in the sense that like, they put a lot of investment in trying to figure out their geological formation footprint and opportunities to drill. And so they ended up sharing that as well. They also stepped up the plate and started putting in their own seismic arrays to be able to better monitor and understand what's going on. And then it was a big technology puzzle, Rubik's Cube, in that the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, who was responsible for kind of making regulatory determinations, they would get all this data and a big major might send them, reams of data in a spreadsheet. Somebody else might take a snapshot of a napkin they wrote on the back of their one saltwater disposal well, and they were looking at like volume and pressure and all that. Yeah. And so I remember showing up to the Corporation Commission and the team that they stood up to do it. I was looking at their computer and it was like churning, and I'm like, "Hey, what's going on here?" Well, they didn't have enough RAM. You know, they
Yeah.
didn't. They literally, from just an IT technical standpoint, couldn't synthesize all that was going on.
Yeah.
And so we got some emergency funds. We were able to stand up an IT project in the background that they call now like the Awesome tool, which basically takes all the known fault data, takes all the pressure, takes all the water, takes a bunch of other the history of the earthquakes, a bunch of other data points, puts that all in so they can actually get a better snapshot of where to kind of close the noose around troubled areas.
Right.
Whereas before, at the very beginning, it was much more of a shotgun approach.
Right.
This was much more of a rifle approach. And as you all know, we got 77 counties, 76 of those, it's all in the Corporation Commission. Osage right now
Yeah.
has always been under the feds, which means Region 6 EPA down in Dallas. Well, when they had an earthquake that was in their county, that was pretty significant. All that was paper-based too. Like they were running way behind where we were on the federal level of what to deal with it. So they picked up the phone and called us and was like, what would you recommend? And so we were actually ahead because we were collaborating with industry, with regulators, with technology, with researchers in a way that proved helpful on the federal side.
Yeah.
And we're able to come up with that. So it's been about 2-3 years since I've been engaged in any meaningful way, but obviously they leveled off probably for a lot of reasons. But one is because they have better insight and intel and better monitoring and mitigation, and the other part is probably some of the drilling activity in those particular high cut water areas have backed off.
Yeah, it's interesting that what you just described around some companies having just huge amounts of data that's housed in a certain way, and other companies having just like a picture of a napkin with stuff drawn on it. I mean, I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, probably not in some respects.
Yeah,
but
that's exactly what
that's like a micro, that's like an analogy for like the entire oil and gas industry. I think there's a huge data problem, and maybe this will play into some of the tech conversation later around what you're doing today and how some the oil and gas tech may benefit from it. But I think there's a big technology opportunity and problem just with data in general. And I've had some other guests on, but that's the industry. You've got this tremendous amounts of data. We've got problems that we have to solve. Sometimes they're economic problems. Sometimes they're environmental problems like you're talking about with the earthquakes. But it's pretty cool that you guys were able to come up with a solution where you're able to harness that and get to, like you said, a rifle shot solution to be able to target and actually make regulations that I think, could be for some of these other reasons you mentioned. But to me, like, it seems like it worked. Like the earthquakes have died down and no one's really talking about them anymore. And there still was a lot of drilling. Like think about even 2018, 2019, 160, 170 rigs. Now Oklahoma's fallen way off. It was started to fall off before COVID.
Well, think about this, Max. People used to drill in the ground and they'd be like, well, what is this oil?
Yeah.
Because that's not what they were looking for, right? They were looking to drill a water well or do something else.
Right.
And then they'd be like, what is this oil? But then they found a whole market and a whole industry and a whole energy that can be. Then they'd have this nat gas. What is this nat gas, right? Well, then they figured all that out and stuff. And then there's this whole midstream thing, which you could give your dissertation on right now. Well, now you have produced water.
Yep.
Right. And you're seeing this is that companies are outsourcing their water, and whether it's cleaning it, whether it's refracs, whether it's basically a midstream for water.
Sure.
You well know is developed. And I think that's kind of the next frontier of energy and monetization and what can you do with it. Once that 60 minutes went off, I'm not even kidding you. Like our phones ring nonstop, and really smart organizations and people, your major oilfield service companies or GE in town, we're trying to like attack the problem and figure it out and how to make it economical as far as all that. On the flip side, I'm not even kidding you. Was I at the Capitol one time where a state senator had put us all around a table with some guy who said he came up from his district with an idea that he had replicated in his bathtub about like how to clean the water. If only he had $1 million, he'd be able to build the prototype in like his backyard. I mean, it was like this yin and yang, kind of a thing. It was pretty crazy. It was, we had a lot of Wild West people with some interesting ideas. And the question is, how do you make it economical? How do you get it to a point you can clean water, any water basically, up until you can put it in this bottle and drink it? The question is, what's the cost and energy that needs to be expended, and does it supersede the amount of cost and energy to even extract it, right? So
I've heard someone the other day, they were talking about, there's a lot of sky is falling rhetoric in the energy industry around just all this stuff going on with the current administration and just moving into the future and how we're going to be regulated and how the different lines of attack on the industry. And someone brought up, I can't remember where I read, it was either on Twitter or someone said it to me, I can't remember, but they basically were like, once they really get a stranglehold on water and regulating water and some of these energy plays, that's going to be the way they really kill oil and gas. It was just like a blanket comment. I don't know what that means. It's a loaded comment, but they basically said that there are ways to go after, regulating water that could really restrict oil and gas production more so than maybe some of these other tactics that they've used in the past. And I just don't know if there's anything on that front in terms of that's been done or that you've heard talked about that would really impact.
Yeah, I mean, the Obama administration, that's exactly what they did with their water regulations. Basically anything on your property that could even potentially hold water at some point, like say if there was a torrential downpour and then there could be, a retention kind of element of water for a while, like they asserted their jurisdiction over that. So it was they made a big power play and push in and around that. Biden, it was interesting. So like, I don't care if people are Republican or Democrat. I'll just talk facts. We're in an era where the last election cycle for president of the United States, for one political party, every single one of the major party candidates took a pledge or verbalized that they were against fracking.
Yeah.
Now, I'm saying that they don't know what that actually means. They apply that word to the entire oil and gas process.
Right.
And I think if any of them were pushed on it, they couldn't give you any sort of detail around what does actually, stimulation and fraction mean as relates to all that kind of stuff. But that's a pretty significant position. It wasn't in the extreme elements. I don't think a Bill Clinton or even Obama said that initially in his first run at the White House, because he realized, no, we can't shut down America's energy and goal for independence. That's crazy and uneconomical and put all these people out.
Right. It's a little bit regressive tax.
The last part of the election cycle, you'll remember, was in Pennsylvania, and Biden was nuancing whether, like, it was like what he meant when he said he was against fracking or not for it, because he didn't want to lose those votes in that swing state, right? But the party's over as far as like he's revealed himself of who, and do I really personally think he's this far to the left? Probably not, but I think those around him are.
Yeah. And
so, the first 30, 60 days with his executive orders in and around oil and natural gas obviously have been reflective of what that base who elected him really wants. So for our industry to say that we only have two major political parties, for one of the parties to be reflexively out of hand just as a starting point for running for their highest office within their party to be against or oppose our industry is pretty significant. It's pretty unheard of.
I think that there's partially a reason why we have the luxury, right, of having that viewpoint, that they're against fracking and they're against oil and gas. And I think part of that is just this, effectively not quite a decade, I guess since 2014, where we've seen this sustained drop in the raw input for primarily transportation, which is the thing that affects most people, the poorest people certainly, but you've got this ability for people to buy big SUVs and trucks and drive around, and especially in rural parts of the country, the cities is probably not as big of a deal, but certainly we've had this luxury of really cheap energy costs. And so it's easy to say, hey, I want to ban this thing that ultimately, if we did ban fracking in the U.S. or if we did significantly restrict it, it would be very regressive. It would probably be, I don't know, this is just a flamboyant statement, but I would say it would probably be the largest tax on the poor ever in the history of the United States if we were to do something like that. And
absolutely be very regressive. And you have to understand is that placating to a base and not just being real with policy is challenging. And a perfect example of that is like the state of New York will not allow any additional pipeline development within their state as a matter of fact or policy. Well, you have Pennsylvania, which butts up right up to it, which is flush with natural gas. Williams Company gave up, as far as I understand it, and trying to get their pipeline approved. Well, what happened was when they had a shortage, they actually had a super tanker come in, from a foe, somebody who doesn't have any environmental regulations, somebody who doesn't have our best interests in mind, and they're
it's happening. So that's the other thing. It's not just the New York situation, but also in California. So I've got a guest coming on who's a guy that's in the California. He's in California. He's in the oil and gas industry, and he's put a bunch of stuff on LinkedIn, kind of criticizing California, and that's what made me where I saw him first and was reading some of the stuff he was posting, and he made some really good points. He was like, "Look, California imports some large percentage of their oil from like countries that are destroying ecosystems." And I can't remember the exact countries, but he has some posts and he's showing, hey, this country is having massive environmental problems because of their oil industry. And by the way, California imports 20% of its oil from this country that's having all these issues. And he's like, what are we doing here? And he's basically just like, this is worse for the environment. We're getting it from somewhere. And it's just kind of this don't ask, mentality of, well, I don't care if it comes from somewhere else that's destroying the environment, but we're going to kind of
We're in this era where I think people who have been involved in the oil and gas industry hear these things, or they see the major candidates for office spouting off reflexively that they're against our industry or want to ban it or want to rein it in. And a lot of people, I would say, of a certain generation, before us, really shake their heads and they get frustrated and they get angry.
Yeah.
The question for you and I, Max, is like, well, how do we appropriately respond and be part of the conversation,
Right.
where we can not just put our heads like in the ground or in the sand and be like, well, those guys are dumb. I really feel like I hear that a lot from like people who've been in the industry for a long time.
Yeah.
They just get really aggressively angry about people that don't understand the commitment to the environment or the way that we do things. But ours is to figure out what the next path is.
Right.
So I was in the governor's office. I saw major investments happening at the time with our majors in what was then the STACK merge and scoop plays, particularly in the STACK,
Right.
multi-billion dollars worth of investments that were going in and being created through publicly traded, but also equity-backed deals. And I asked myself the question with Secretary Teague at the time. I was like, what could be the next hiccup for us if we don't address that, the tiger can get out of the cage, that if we just spent time identifying and addressing it now? And what came out of that conversation or that discovery period was, we moved from vertical to horizontal drilling. What that means in actual impact sense is the number of trucks on the road. And Oklahoma, a lot like plays in Texas and New Mexico, have had traditional drilling. The switch between vertical and horizontal is the number of trucks. So reflexively, people are very supportive of our industry because they've had it there for a number of years. Their neighbors, or someone they know has worked in the industry. They know geologists, they know landmen. They might get some royalty, something in their family or, with their property. They might own a cafe in town or something like that. So they're generally either pro our industry or neutral our industry, I would say, from places that have already been, have had exploration. The challenge is when we come with our new drilling on the horizontal side is then we have all these new trucks come in, and it happens in every single basin. We're sort of then surprised that like a year and a half into it, people are a little bit frustrated.
Yeah.
And it's
oil and it's water and there's a number, and it's service service truck. I mean, there's a ton of truck traffic. I mean, it's not just you're hauling oil, you're hauling water, you're all these different
crews and equipment.
Yeah. I mean, huge amounts.
And so the thought process was, I did a little tour amongst the kind of STACK operating area in the communities, and I kept hearing, hey, we're kind of concerned about all this truck traffic that's showing up in our community. And the county commissioners would point to the state reps, would point to the city managers, and it was just kind of this merry-go-round.
Circular, yeah.
And so my thought process, well, what if we put safety as that priority and our target? And what if we got all these people around a table? And so that was the genesis and the idea I came up with, the Energize for Safety Coalition, which started 3 years ago. And I left the governor's office to form that. I ended up forming it as a nonprofit. I did so. The gentleman at the time who was the chairman of then OCOGA, Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association, and the executive vice president for production at Devon, Wade Hutchings, I met with him about it, and he was very, very encouraging.
Right.
Because he's like, hey, Tom, we have a lot going on at the Capitol right now with our business and public policy. This is happening in our communities. Our number one commitment is the safety. I want you to go tackle this. I believe in you, believe in the plan. So went out, got other, at the time, Newfield, now they're known as Avintiv, Marathon, Devon, and a handful of others that were very supportive. And I just went out there and I built the coalition. To me, it was kind of interesting, but when I met with ODOT, Oklahoma Department of Transportation, and I asked them a simple question like, hey, when do you get together with the oil and gas industry to kind of discuss strategy or where things are going to be going or where the impacts are going to be? They said, well, never, right?
Yeah.
Again, Oklahoma, they're not like anti our industry. It's just not, it wasn't part of their process. No one really had done that. And so the Secretary of Transportation, when I presented this to him, he was like, oh, I'd love for you to do this. I'd love for you to lead this effort. Went over to the Commissioner of Public Safety, had the conversation, and he filled my ear up with like, yeah, we're seeing all this stuff with truck traffic and in these communities, and they're kind of overwhelmed and they're screaming uncle. I'm like, well, when have you ever sat down with like the lead safety fleet guys for all the oil and gas people? He's like, never, Yeah. And I asked the oil and gas guys, when do you like plan for these construction projects? And they go, when the signs go up.
Right.
And I'm like, hey, this is like 2018. We got to change all that. So we brought that all together. I also got a bunch of nonprofit partners. And so like Oklahoma Safety Council, we work with the Oklahoma Highway Safety Office. So the Highway Safety Office, their data is 18 months in the rears behind.
Right.
So because there's still county cops out there like taking paper
Yeah.
reports and everything. And so they'd seen an uptick and they knew people were worried about it, but they didn't know quite what to do. I said, okay, well, what if I put a bunch of energy people in a room with you? You can pick their brain. We can talk about this, and then we can identify stuff and go at it. And they're like, great. Because they have stuff for seatbelts and speeding and tailgating and distraction, but it's all throughout the state. And I said, well, what if through my organization you empowered me to be able to focus it with some of your partners so that we could really nip it in the bud on the front end and really address this head on? And they were like, oh man, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So we formed it. We started meeting. We our first year we focused in on the stack, mostly like Blaine and Kingfisher counties, and had great success between Watonga and Kingfisher is a 2-lane highway. We identified that as a major corridor, no matter where you were at in that stack, that you needed to utilize that. And crashes were going up, and so we said, okay, game on. And we went to work. And so I found out about this thing called the Highway Safety Corridor, which is a tool that Department of Public Safety and ODOT, Oklahoma Department of Transportation, have to be able to address a highway that's going in the wrong direction. And I said, okay, let's not wait. Let's address this. If you guys deputize me, I'll put this all together. And they said, okay, go. And so we put that together. The ODOT did the study and the traffic study on it, did the engineering studies for it. We put it in there. Well, 2 years into it, we've reduced crashes on that highway by 62%.
Wow.
So we had reduced speed. We had enhanced enforcement. We did a whole education engagement point. So it was all hands working together. In fact, that won us a award for the ODOT's association, the Association of Highway State Transportation Officials, gave us their Best in the West Technology Application Award for doing that project.
It's pretty cool because before you did all this, I remember we had lunch or something, or coffee maybe or something. We sat down and got together, and you were kind of telling me and laying this out, and I was like, that's really interesting. It was just like it was an interesting angle around seeing the, because like I'm all involved in energy entrepreneurship, and so I'm always talking to people, or me and myself thinking about ways to look at what the problems are in the industry and how do you, given your collective skill sets of you and whoever you're working with, like how can you solve these problems? And I'm not usually doing nonprofit, but most of the stuff I'm doing is for profit and looking at like, hey, how can I use my skill set to like solve a need in this industry? And so when I heard about it, I was like, that's a really cool thing that could, number one, be actually really good for the community. Like you said, reducing crashes, which is probably in some ways, directly either save lives or saved at least injury. And then the other thing is just a way to look at like, as these developments are happening, there's so many moving pieces and how it affects a community, and that you were able to identify that and build a nonprofit around it, I think is really neat.
Yeah, we did. We pioneered a new model. So education, engagement, engineering, and enforcement, the 4 E's that we call it. NHTSA, which is the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, Region 6, they're really excited about it. They're sharing it in their region with Texas, Louisiana, and other gas-producing states. And what that entails is not only did we get the engineering right, not only did we get the enforcement right, we got the education engagement. So like on Highway 33, there's a trade school there, a tech school where all the local high schools go into, a couple hundred kids. And the principal just looked at me and said, hey, look, I can't breathe until all my kids are on campus and staff are on campus because of all the equipment out there. I said, okay, Max is his name. I said, will you partner with me and trust me to partner? I promise I'll get some stuff done. Will you work with me? I said, well, yeah. And that's how reflexively people are in Oklahoma.
Right.
And so I said, okay, so we put all his kids through advanced training, driver training. Then we pioneered this new thing, and we do it all over in places where oil and gas is produced. We call it an energy driver safety day for the teens. And what we do is we bring our partners from the Oklahoma Highway Safety Office, and they're out there talking about seatbelts, and they're talking about drunk driving, and they're talking about distracted driving. But then I also bring in all of my energy trucks and equipment. So all the things that you see on the road. Now those kids do not appreciate, understand, know, or have anyone talk to them about tailgating, stopping speeds, blind spots, and all those things. You're going over a hill, you're frustrated, you've been behind this tanker for a while, you try to speed up, and like, why don't you do that, right? And the industry has a great commitment to safety. The reason why is traffic-related incidences are the number one reason for fatalities in our industry.
Yeah.
So with everything we're doing on a rig, everything what we're doing on the floor, all that kind of stuff, on the midstream side, and all the things that we're doing, it's actually on the transportation side is the number one contributor to fatality. So we've built a system within our industry of best practices around how do we address that. And so then what we've been able to do is share those with the community and get them on our team to be able to drive safety together.
Right. Yeah. If you look at like a lot of times, if you're looking at like an asset acquisition, which we do, and you'll see like the safety slides in like whatever asset you're trying to buy or company you're trying to buy. My experience is typically like traffic related safety incidents are like the number one thing you see. And that's just anecdotally, but it's like, oh, we had like a fender bender, we had a guy get hit, and it's like they'll list out their safety incidents. Yes, you'll see things every once in a while that are on site, something that happened, but man, the ones I've looked at, it's almost always some kind of traffic thing is the main incidents that they have to list. So it makes sense what you're saying.
Yeah. So we know that 62% reduction in crashes that we have had on Highway 33 not only have helped the community, but also our industry, and it hits directly in the pocketbook when you're trying to re-up for your insurance and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So it's a true win-win, and it's a way to address the thing that's also shifted since the other generations have been involved in energy. Max, is like everybody's a reporter. What I mean by that is everybody has an iPhone.
Yeah.
And everybody has access to their
Right.
network. And so I would see up in the stack, like on the Facebook page for Kingfisher or whatever, we had some flooding and stuff. There were some oil and gas trucks that went around the cones and just trying
Someone's like with their cell
to,
phone.
and like posted it, has hundreds of comments and like hundreds of shares. Within a local system, that means like everybody in that county is basically seeing that.
Yeah.
What I tell the operators is even though you're very proud of your safety record and your program and stuff, we're only good as the worst day of our worst sub.
Right.
And because as much pride that we have in our individual logos, colors, and team, like the community basically just lumps us all together as energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we get very prideful for the particular company that we worked at. We just worked at Chesapeake. We had a lot of Chesapeake pride when we were there. But out in the field, generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, they're not like, wait, was that a red truck? Was that a blue truck? Did that
Right.
have that logo on it?
Yeah.
People either praise us or curse us under their breath, and they do so on behalf of energy.
Right.
And everybody's a reporter, and that information, those pictures, get shared everywhere instantaneously.
Yep.
And so the question is, are we going to be at the table and engage up front, or are we just going to be reactive and try to deal with people's concerns on the back end?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really cool story what you've done with it. And we're getting we're up here against an hour, so I want to be mindful of your time. But after that, some of the other stuff you've done, you do a lot of different things. So that's one of the things as we've connected recently that I've been very interested in is that I've got very much a passion for entrepreneurship and understanding the different, it's just one of these things that I have where I always want to hear about people's stories, especially like founders of companies or founders of projects. I'm always like, how did you get involved doing what you're doing? Or how did somebody that started a company or did something, I always want to hear that story. It's just interesting to me. And so when I talk to somebody like you, that you're doing other things outside of energy, and you've done a lot of different things. I mean, you even had you had an Airbnb idea the other day that you talked to me about, which I loved. And it's actually, I think, a great trend because I'm into some real estate stuff. So, but I think specifically around this, talk some about the tech stuff you've been doing. And then maybe we can kind of dovetail that into how it may work with energy. But even if we don't get into how it relates to energy, I just think it's really interesting. And I'd love for you to talk about it.
Well, so, I mean, kind of the way my mind works is I like to try to think of like, where is trends and investments happening? And then where are some like gaps?
Yep.
And what can be done to address those? And my skill set tends to be around like coalitions and government affairs and public relations and community engagement. So that's what I kind of like lean on as far as my training of doing that the last 20 years or so in DC and in Oklahoma. And so for the tech thing that you're talking about is, I've gotten to meet a lot of different friends, and Oklahoma's great. It's a low cost, easy place to start a business and be entrepreneurial.
Right.
You can take some big risks. And, so I've met people that are doing great things in the tech and innovation space, and they're headquartered here in Oklahoma. And a common theme that I got from them and feedback was they were frustrated with the state. They would try to, or have an idea that they would try to elevate, because a lot of the way that the state is set up digitally is kind of, Fred Flintstone-esque in the way you interact with it. Oklahoma Employment Security Commission that just got fleeced, for tens of millions of dollars because they were on an old system that was totally exploited and basically collapsed when any pressure was on it. And so, or they would go and say, hey, I have a great idea and I want to bid on this contract for the state. And then they would, and they wouldn't hear anything, and it would go to some out-of-state company that they'd never heard of, and they were kind of scratching their head. And so I asked a very simple question. I was like, well, how do you guys organize? Like what are your priorities? How do you get those in front of policymakers? How does that work? And the two CEOs I was talking to, these IT companies, were like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And to me, it's so obvious and it's so clear. Well, guys, oil and gas industry, dentists, accountants, they all have these associations within their state to be able to mutually look at what are our priorities, what are our challenges, and then go tell that story to policymakers, because policymakers aren't experts in what you do, to be able to identify what are some of the low-hanging fruit and opportunities and challenges.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, yeah, we should probably do that.
Yeah.
And it kind of blew my mind. So, like, I look at tech infrastructure the same way maybe like you look at road infrastructure. It's essential. There's nothing you can do in the economy or business without like the roads and bridges that we have in the state.
Right.
Well, now in the now that we're 2021 beyond, you can't do anything, particularly like, gosh, with this pandemic, like you can't do anything without an IT infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it's critical.
Right.
Like business either grinds to a halt or is elevated and accelerates through IT. And so they asked me to put together a proposal, and I did, and we got some great feedback from some of our senior decision leaders and policymakers in the state, and said, yes, we absolutely need to do that. So at the beginning of this year, we formed OITA, which is the Oklahoma Innovative Technology Alliance. You can find us at oklahomaita.com.
Yep.
And it's the first trade association that is the home and voice for Oklahoma headquartered IT. So if you're a company and that you're headquartered in Oklahoma, you're doing IT, you're doing innovation, we're your group. And we approached the state, we started talking to the state, and just asked kind of some simple questions of like, hey, these great companies that have millions of dollars in revenue, have open jobs, have great contracts, like they've bid on some stuff, they're not hearing anything back. And the kind of feedback was, well, we don't give feedback to any companies right now, if that makes you feel any better. And I'm like, okay, well, now we know where we need to start.
Really.
Right. And again, like I look at it with like oil and gas regulation and infrastructure. The people of the state, they're not trying to give like a middle finger to the oil and gas industry. Well, it's not like the state's trying to give a middle finger to the IT industry that's here, but they need to know that the IT industry exists, that there's leaders here.
Right.
Interesting enough, and I think oil and gas is very pro-diversifying our economy. You talk to any oil and gas industry, they want other industries to be here so that when the bucket gets passed around at the Capitol, not all eyes are on oil and gas, right?
Right.
And so look at, for example, Paycom. What is Paycom? They're the number one Fortune 500 company by revenue in the state of Oklahoma. If you would have said that a non-oil and gas, non-energy company would have filled that role or slot in Oklahoma 10 years ago, we both would have looked at each other crosswise. Yeah. But they're a software, company. And so they're a member, they're on our board, but then we also have companies that, obviously are much smaller, but have great paying jobs, and have great contracts, great things that they do within the IT and innovation space. That's like cutting edge.
Well, I think we're like really poised to pull some of the tech movement from Texas that's happening right now. You've got Austin and Dallas and some of these other cities where there's a lot of tech, companies moving to. You've got companies moving from California. But you're even seeing it now. I saw a thing on, I think, Twitter today where they were saying based on historical averages of cost of living that like Austin and some of these Houston, some of these other Texas cities are based on a historical, I don't know what the metric was, but they're actually more expensive than like San Francisco and New York and all these places because they've actually gotten hurt during the COVID downturn. And then some of these other areas are actually still having this huge influx. And so Oklahoma's sitting right here. We're not far away from Texas. We've got, I think, good reasons why people would want to come here. Maybe other people in the country would argue not.
Everyone I talk to in the IT space has a different reason for why they're here, why they're headquartered here.
Yep.
But whatever that is, we need to elevate that to policymakers so that we can replicate and duplicate that and expand that so we can have a much more diversified economy. We want to digitize the state. We want to educate policymakers. We want high-paying jobs.
Yep.
And we want companies that are willing to headquarter here as a part of that, to be a part of this growth story and to invest into our people, our communities, and our culture and be a part of all that. So a lot of it is on us. When I say us, it's tech industry in Oklahoma to educate the policymakers, because we hosted our first coffee and conversation with legislators at the very beginning of this year. Up to then, they'd never even had that conversation. So we're getting feedback like, hey, after this legislative session, can we come talk to you guys? Can we bounce ideas off of you? Can we get feedback? Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Because, oil and gas is similar in that, people don't really understand oil and gas, but then the industry gets them in a rig or at a midstream facility or in a corporate headquarters dealing with land. Like they get them through that process early on in their legislative careers. Well, tech is similar in that most people are probably like, well, what's tech? It's the people that keep my email running and my computer software updated. There's so much more than that.
Now.
And I would say that every business that's starting right now that has some sort of growth potential, that's really creating opportunity and jobs, is solving a problem through innovation and technology.
Right.
And so that does include oil and gas. So we've talked to some companies that are in the oil and gas space, and we have some great companies right here headquartered in Oklahoma that are dealing with, from a technology standpoint, how do you monitor and then mitigate sort of like fugitive emissions around methane or other, gases and stuff. We have companies that are hiring drone pilots right now that are in the energy space. So there's all this innovation and technology that is happening. And what I see too is you have some of the money that was spent in the equity space that people have learned to be able to apply in the energy that are now looking for technology. So Cortado Ventures, I think, which is a member of ours, would be a great example of this. Nathaniel Harding, who's over there, he's built out and has his kind of background all in oil and gas. And now he's using a lot of those skill sets, relationships, and opportunities to pour that back into Oklahoma by investing in innovative and technology companies here that are in Oklahoma, some who have a tie into natural, or some who have a tie into energy, some who don't.
Yeah.
But I'm just blown away of how much potential there is. And the fact that we never had the opportunity before to dialogue with our state about these are innovation technology companies, they're headquartered here. Let's get a seat at the table. Now that that's happening, it's amazing. Literally our next meeting, it's with the state and with all their kind of key leadership that we identified. And the whole topic of the agenda is that the state now wants to roll out a plan to target IT companies that are headquartered in Oklahoma. And the whole reason is because they realize what a great opportunity that is.
Yeah.
The fact that that wasn't happening before blows my mind.
It's crazy. No, it's great. Like, this isn't one that when you were telling me about it got me all excited. Not that I am really involved in the tech space at all, but I was just like, that's another good idea where you identified something that you felt like there was an opportunity there and it solved a problem and it was win-win, right? It's a win-win for these companies and these entrepreneurs and these startups, and it's a win for the state. I mean, it's a win-win solution in my mind. And I think that there's a lot that Oklahoma can do, and you probably know better because you're talking to the stakeholders and the people that are making the decisions on why they're here or why they've been brought here. One that I brought up to you the other day, and in oil and gas stuff, it always seems to, lately I've been coming back to this Bitcoin thing that I brought up to you the other day, and we looked at like what Wyoming's doing and then what Kentucky's recently passed. I don't know all the details around it, but they're kind of trying to be incentivizing some of the crypto stuff to come to those states. And I called you like when I saw that, and I was like, hey, like we've got all this natural resource, why don't we, and these guys are looking for places that are regulation friendly. So that was one too that I thought, even like there's a lot with tech, and I think oil and gas is going to cross over with it, whether that be on the ESG side and figuring out how to do this new green tech stuff with this energy transition that everybody's talking about, or whether it be like this Bitcoin thing, which may be a little out of the box for some people, but I think may be becoming more mainstream. So having this thing that you've built or that you helped put together is going to help facilitate ideas like that into getting it into the people that can actually facilitate
and the nugget
change.
I would leave people that are here in Oklahoma is, look, you have a citizen legislature. Well, what does that mean, Robbins? What that means is that when you're calling or reaching out to your legislator, they don't have like a policy team. They don't have legislative assistants. They have like a kind of staffer that's answering the phones, getting back to people on email and scheduling some things.
Right.
But they in their office, almost 95% of them don't have that policy person.
Right.
So they count on, whether it's a trade association or an industry leader or an entrepreneur or a constituent, however it is, lobbyists, to reach out to them and say, hey, have you thought about this? Or what's this opportunity? Or let me give you these examples in these states. Or this type of regulatory language seems to work here. I think we could do it better if we did it this way. And I think that's lost on a lot of people. They sort of reflexively think that legislators in Oklahoma are like United States congressmen or senators that have, dozens of interns, staff, people. And it's just not like that. When you call your state senator or state representative, you're calling their cell phone. You're emailing them directly.
Right.
That contact is great. You can get in front of the right decision makers very quickly to execute on an idea, and you can scale something. And I think you can get lift or get ideas. So there's a lot of competitive advantage. There's less barrier to entry, I think, to great ideas, to elevating them. But I think people are sitting around waiting for other people to like do smart or good things. And really, it's incumbent on ourselves.
Yeah, that's great. Man, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a good conversation. We might have to do it again sometime, and I may have to leverage you to help me get some awesome guests. You've already been super helpful. You've given me pointers before I did it. You've passed me on to people that are in the podcast space that have given me good advice. And I even think you've kicked guests my way. So not only appreciate you coming on, but appreciate everything else you do and the generosity you have as a friend. So
appreciate it. It's always a great day when you can talk energy.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you.